Jimi Hendrix is arguably the greatest and most innovative guitarist of all time, combining rocking riffs with inventive new techniques to create a sound so uniquely Hendrixian that you could recognise one of his songs simply from the isolated guitar track. But you already knew that, or at least I'm guessing you're aware since you clicked on a video about the man. Over a sadly brief career, cut short by a tragic death which led to Jimi being one of the first members of the infamous 27 Club, Hendrix recorded 3 brilliant albums with his band The Jimi Hendrix Experience and became famous for his legendary live performances, one of which we're talking about today. For a bit more background, it should be known that Hendrix absolutely loved guitar for practically his whole life, and long before he ever received an instrument, he used to carry around a broom pretending it was a guitar. For most of his childhood, his family did not have the ability, or sadly some sources say they possibly did, but didn't want to, buy Jimi the guitar he so desperately desired. However, luckily for him, at the age of 14, he managed to get his hands on a guitar. Of sorts. Okay, it was a ukulele with only one string left, but that didn't matter to young Hendrix. He finally had a guitar, and would spend most of his time learning songs by ear and playing them on his disfigured uke. For almost a year, this kept Jimi happy, until finally, in 1958, he had saved up enough money to get a proper guitar, and bought his first acoustic for $5, equivalent to $44 or 35 quid today. From that moment, Hendrix would be found spending every free second he had playing his guitar. He would listen to the greats of blues, such as B.B. King and Robert Johnson, and attempt to emulate them, although it wouldn't be too long till he was the one people would be copying. Throughout the rest of his teens and early 20s, Hendrix could be pretty much constantly found playing his guitar. Another hobby he had at the time, though, was stealing cars and joyriding, which subsequently led him to be enlisted in mandatory military service to avoid prison. Jimi hated every second of his time in the 101st Airborne, and in fact it was guitar playing which eventually earned him the honourable discharge he desperately desired. His discharging officer stated that without his guitar he did not believe Hendrix could function, and as such he had no business being in the army. If you're interested in learning more about this great story, I'll link the Fact Fiend video below where they go into more depth. But suffice to say, if that doesn't prove Jimi's passion for guitar, I'm not sure what will. But after leaving his military service, Hendrix properly began his path to greatness within the music industry. Beginning in 1963, Hendrix toured America as a guitarist for several successful musicians of the time, including Jackie Wilson, Sam Cooke, and Ike and Tina Turner. However, whilst he made a name for himself among his contemporaries at the time, he never managed to achieve any sort of mainstream recognition. The highlights of this stage of his career included appearing on national TV and playing on a few top 40 singles. Nothing compared to the extreme heights he would receive at the peak of his career. Growing bored of the touring life, Hendrix moved to New York to try and make a name for himself playing the club scene. During this time, Jimi attracted the attention of the girlfriend of Rolling Stones guitarist Keith Richards with his playing. She said that his playing was mesmerising, and Linda, Keith and Hendrix went on to be lifelong friends. After a string of unsuccessful demos, Richards then recommended Hendrix to Chas Chandler, formerly of the Animals, who was interested in managing and producing artists. Chandler saw Jimi's potential, which so many had overlooked, and signed Hendrix to a deal alongside the former manager of the Animals, Michael Jeffries, making Chandler and Jeffries co-managers of Hendrix. This deal saw Hendrix making a move across the Atlantic to London, where his career would finally skyrocket to the heights he deserved. With the move to London, Chandler set about recruiting a band for his star child to front. Hendrix met Noel Redding at an audition for the New Animals and was impressed with his knowledge of the blues. Later, Chandler discovered the drummer Mitch Mitchell, and with this trio combined, the Jimi Hendrix Experience was formed. Interestingly, throughout his life up to this point, Jimi had spelled his name the traditional way, with 2 M's and a Y. However, Chandler convinced him to adopt the iconic spelling we all know, stating it was more exotic and better to sell. The Experience played the typical London club scene in '66 and quickly gained the attention of many of the greats of the day, including Eric Clapton, who first met Jimi when the Experience supported Cream at the London Polytechnic. Clapton is noted in saying his life was never the same after first seeing Hendrix play live, a sentiment any who are lucky enough to see him I'm sure would agree with. It is at one of these live performances that the story we're here to talk about today took place. On Sunday the 28th of May 1967, the Jimi Hendrix Experience played a gig in London, as they had very regularly since forming a year prior. They were riding high on the success of their first album, Are You Experienced, which had released on the 12th of May and had climbed all the way to number 2 on the UK charts. This meant that everyone in the UK music scene was now aware of Hendrix, and as such the crowd was full of huge names, notably including the Beatles, who themselves were riding pretty high, having just released Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, arguably the greatest album of all time 2 days prior, which went straight to number 1 and was actually the album which kept Are You Experienced off the top spot. Despite having been deprived of the crown by the Beatles, though, Hendrix didn't seem to hold any bad feelings and in fact showed nothing but admiration towards the Beatles. How do we know this? Oh, just because to start the show, Jimmy took to the stage and began shouting the iconic quote, "Watch out for your ears," to the audience. Not just wanting to sound like a badass, which he undoubtedly did, Hendrix was genuinely worried for the people sat in the front due to just how loud his speakers were. After that, Hendrix began his set with the first song, a rip-roaring rock and roll cover of the title track from the aforementioned Beatles album, Sgt. Pepper. Now, the cover itself is absolutely belting and shows off all of Hendrix's talents as a guitarist. When you can cover a song so well the writers are amazed, you know you're doing a good job. Something Hendrix seemed to make a hobby of, doing the same with Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower a few years later. But what is really impressive about this is that, as mentioned, the album and song were only released 2 days prior. The song wasn't released as a single either. The Beatles preferred to keep their singles and albums set as separate entities. So that means in just 48 hours, Hendrix managed to learn a pretty tricky song and then give it his own flair, all in the days before internet and any sort of help was gone. Also would like to note he had no contact with the Beatles or help from them. The man did this himself. Paul McCartney has commented on the performance before, saying how brilliant it was, and if you're not convinced by that seal of approval, there's some footage that I'll link below in the description just to show how great the cover was. Now, the only downside to Hendrix's style of play, which includes hammering at the strings and physically bending the guitar to get the desired sound, is that it really quickly detunes your guitar, and as such, after the first song, Jimmy's guitar was near unplayable. Knowing the guitar needed tuning for the rest of the performance to go ahead, Hendrix simply called out, "Hey, is Eric there?" And you may be wondering, who's Eric? A roadie? A technician? No, Hendrix was asking if Slowhand himself, Eric Clapton, was in the audience watching him and would be able to come up and tune his guitar for him. Clapton at the time, by the way, was with his supergroup Cream, selling millions and was widely regarded by many as the greatest guitarist in the world. A title Hendrix would quickly rise to compete with, but at this time, remember, Hendrix has only released one album, and whilst he is very respected, is nowhere near the level Clapton was, as far as notoriety went. But as it turned out, yeah, Eric was in the audience and gladly offered his services, going up to the stage to tune Hendrix's guitar for him. And so from that, an unreal set continued, and Hendrix would go on to create a legacy the likes of which the world had never seen before and may never see again. So that's all for our story for today, and it only scratches the surface of just how brilliant Hendrix was as a musician and as a man. If you enjoyed, leaving a like and subscribing really helps the channel, and comment what your favourite Hendrix track is. Personally, mine's Voodoo Child. Otherwise, have an awesome day, and we'll see you in the next one.